everyone. My name is Lucinda Walker. I'm the director of the Norwich Library, and on behalf of the Norwich Historical Society and the library, we'd like to welcome you to First Wednesdays. This is our last lecture for the year. It's been a wonderful, as always, series this year. And in fact, we've already started planning for next year. You will probably hear the list of speakers towards the end of July is when the list gets finalized. But I have it from the word of one of our speakers next year that Nancy Crumbine will be here to talk about E.B. White and the environment in November. So that's like a little heads up for the future. And fits in lovely for tonight's talk. First Wednesdays is a program of the Vermont Humanities Council and is co-hosted by the library and the Historical Society. The Humanities Council receives support from the Vermont Department of Libraries and the National Life Group Foundation. The Historical Society and the library receive corporate support from the Friends of the Norwich Public Library, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Ledger National Bank, Mascoma Savings Bank, and the Norwich Historical Society. I want to do a few plugs for some library things, which is we have our Mother's Day plant sale sponsored by the Friends of the Library this Saturday and Sunday. And as an added benefit, Killdeer has very generously offered to donate 10% of any sale they do at the greenhouses this weekend to the Friends of the Public Library. So I know the sun will shine and there will be warmth at some point, and we will want to sow the seeds and see something grow. So come on out this weekend. If you have a mobile device, please turn it off. And our speaker tonight, Gus SPETH, served on the faculty of the Vermont Law School as professor of law from 2010 to 2015. He now serves as Distinguished Senior Fellow at Demos, Associate Fellow at the Telus Institute, and Senior Fellow at the Democracy Collaborative and the Vermont Law School. In 2009, he completed his decade-long tenure as Dean, Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. From 1993 to 1999, he was administrator of the United Nations Development Program and chair of the UN Development Group. Prior to his service at the UN, he was founder and president of the World Resources Institute, professor of law at Georgetown University, chairman of the U.S. Council on Environmental Quality, and senior attorney and co-founder of the National Resources Defense Council. He is co-chair of the Next Systems Project at the Democracy Collaborative. Gus is the recipient of numerous awards, including the National Wildlife Federation's Resources Defense Award and Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Environmental Law Institute and the League of Conservation Voters. He is the author, co-author, and editor of 7 books, including Red Sky and Warning, America, and the Crisis of the Global Environment and America the Possible, Manifesto for a New Economy. And the bookstore is selling Angels by the River, his memoir, and Gus has very generously offered to sign books and do Q&A afterwards. And once again, thank you for coming tonight, and please join me in welcoming Gus.
Well, thank all of you for coming out, and thank Lucinda for that very nice introduction. All the groups that she mentioned have done better after I left. If I lose my track tonight, it'll be because we just got back from Europe last night. I think I'm in Norwich, I'm not sure. It's an honor to participate in this really distinguished series. I'm not quite sure what I'm doing here. And I must commend the Humanities Council for sponsoring this. I guess it's 5, 6 cities that it goes on. More than that now. And thank you especially for this opportunity to talk about my favorite subject, subject of this wonderful book. I've been asked to talk about how I personally got interested in environmental issues, and from this little community in backwoods South Carolina, became an environmental activist, and helped to launch the Natural Resources Defense Council in 1970, around the time of the first Earth Day, and to give my opinion on what I think of the situation now. And I did succumb recently to the temptation to write a memoir about all this, and I covered that half century in this little book. It really reflects everything I've learned, and it's very short. I've heard some writers say that when they finish something, they never want to read it again. I don't have that problem. And I'm going to inflict on you some passages, short, from the book. And I said it better there than I think could otherwise do. But I just want to cover two topics. One is this sort of predisposition to take up environmental issues. And I think probably everyone in this room has had a similar set of experiences when young. And then I want to talk a little bit about starting from the book, about starting the Natural Resources Defense Council, and just give you a little insight there. So I want to begin with this river in the title, Angels by the River. The Edisto River rises in the sand hills of central South Carolina and glides like a glistening black snake through the Carolina low country towards the coast. Its dark tannin-stained waters spread out over both banks into swamps of tall cypress and tupelo and sweet gum, draped with Spanish moss, an environment welcoming to the sunfish and heron and occasional alligator and water moccasin. On its way through the hardwood bottomlands and on down to the tidal marshes, the Edisto passes through Orangeburg, South Carolina, where I was born and raised. I grew up there in the 40s and 50s in a small agricultural community that was the county seat. And our house was about a mile from a swimming area that the town had established down from a high bluff along the Edisto. We swam there every summer. On the several terraces from the bluff's top down to the water, the girls spread blankets on the grass and worked on their one-piece cans. And near the riverbank, benches ran between the large cypress trees where the mothers sat watching their children play in the shallow water near the edge. A pavilion on the top of the bluff served Royal Crown colas and hot dogs, and we racked up points on the pinball machines there and listened to the jukebox play 60-Minute Man, a song to fuel a young boy's fantasies if there ever was one. That Edisto is the river of my life. I discovered the natural world there, learned a bit about girls, and learned how to swim against the current and how to dance slowly with Cameron Council in the pavilion on Friday nights after our football games. And we were really lucky to have Miss Council join us tonight. Would you? Here she is. It's been 51 years since we were married. On a dare late one night, I stripped and floated down the Edisto from the final rope across the swimming area for a half mile down to the US 301 bridge. I remember it was very peaceful, drifting with the current, unable to see much of anything in the darkness of the Edisto swamp near midnight. For several summers around junior high, I went to visit my granny and granddaddy in their house on Lake Junaluska, tucked in the region between Asheville and the Great Smokies in North Carolina. Their house looked across the lake to Mount Junaluska. I swam in the lake and took Granddaddy's small boat into every corner of it, but I began to notice things I hadn't noticed in Orangeburg. A strong odor hung over the community many mornings, a smell I didn't know. They explained to me that it was the paper mill in Canton. Once we were driving along the French Broad River, and I noticed that the water had a strange color and it was foaming. I asked them, about it, and Granddaddy said it was the result of the rayon plant at Inca. And then one year, I arrived back at Lake Junaluska to find that the whole beautiful 200-acre lake had been contaminated and was closed to swimming and other uses. It was brown and smelly and dead. I was told that a company had dumped its waste into the lake, a tanning operation, I think. It was devastating to me and others. Environmental seeds were surely planted at Lake Junaluska, and planted also when I went north in 1960, really for the first time, to New Haven, and saw the pollution there and elsewhere. The contrast with home was jarring. It wasn't just pollution that I was discovering at Lake Junaluska. It was the sources of the pollution, large companies like Champion Paper and American Inca, and I was beginning to connect the dots. Well, that was a bit about getting predisposed to environmental issues. And then many of you remember from college or graduate school or law school or whatever, that moment when you had to decide what you wanted to do. For goodness sake, you've been tucked away in educational institutions for a long time, and you get to the point, well, now it's decision time, at least the first big decision. And for me, there was a time in October of 1968, and I had at that time what I think of as an important idea. Perhaps it's too grand to call it an epiphany, but I tend to think of it that way. I was riding the New Haven Railroad into New York City, reading the New York Times, and I read one story about the NAACP Legal Defense Fund's litigation, and a story across the way about an environmental issue that caught my eye. And lawyers, which we were training to be at the time, trained to think by analogy, and an idea hit me. Get a group of my impressive classmates together and start a public interest law firm for the environment, just like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund for civil rights issues. And after that, I must say, events moved quite rapidly. Every fellow student I asked to join me in the group accepted. And at that point in American history and environmentalism, there was hardly anything called environmental law. And Yale offered no courses in this field. And to the best of my knowledge, neither did any other law school at that point. We anticipated using common law a lot, tort and nuisance law, and the public trust doctrine, and property and land use law. Our group gelled quickly, and we worked together well, often meeting in our dining room, as Cameron reminds me. By the end of November, we had a name, actually several. We called ourselves at various times LEAF, the Legal Environmental Action Fund, and eventually became the Natural Resources Defense Council. We had a rough startup budget, drafts of articles of incorporation and bylaws, and a list of prospective board members, and soon we were in serious and encouraging conversations with key people at the Ford Foundation, and in March of 1969, we submitted a formal proposal to the Ford Foundation as students. And they gave us the money for next year. I don't know if they would do that today. Might have better judgment. My friend and former dean of the Vermont Law School, Jeff Shields, said to me one day that there was a deeper story of this period that I had to tell. Why did you strike out in the direction you did when most law graduates went to private or practice or to government practice, and how does your story relate to the larger American story, he said. Well, I think Jeff was right. that it is important to understand the birth of the modern environmental movement in America around that first Earth Day, and in particular to understand the debt that those of us who were present at the creation at that moment, the debt that we owed to the civil rights movement through which we had just lived. Yes, we were bright, ambitious law students looking for something different and interesting to do with ourselves, but we were also midstream in a series of important currents of American history, part of an era worth recalling. As I'll try to explain, that recalling can inform and instruct today. We were children of the 60s. Our Yale group had entered college as the civil rights movement was in full swing. We became anti-war as the U.S. troops in Vietnam escalated. Though unfortunately all of our group was male, we were glad to see the birth of the National Organization for Women in 1966. And though we were not hippies or dropouts, we shared much of the counterculture's critique of American society. We were not among the radicals of the 60s, but we were talented lawyers who could use our skills to help right some terrible wrongs. We shared in the 60s, we shared the 60s sense of hope and desire to bring about serious change in American society. We had studied the civil rights litigation and other important cases, and we knew the importance of the law and good lawyering in the public interest. We had seen the impact of social movements, of citizens standing up and speaking out. We knew from the civil rights legislation and otherwise that our government in Washington could do great things, in addition to getting us into great wars. And indeed, that government was essential if great things were to be done. The 60s had taught us that activism could succeed, that government could succeed. We were 1960s idealists, for goodness sake. None of those of us who went into NRDC wanted to go to a law firm, and there were plenty more like us. We could have easily recruited another entire staff from our Yale Law School class of 1969. Indeed, another 9 Yale lawyers from our era would eventually join NRDC. All this youthful energy and hope and idealism we poured into the environmental cause. There's a passage at the beginning of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan where he describes the courtyard geese alerting those inside to an intruder, not because they were they, but there. It was not quite the case with us with the environmental movement. We were, in fact, predisposed to the environmental cause in various ways and did not take it up merely because it was an emerging national concern and thus a wonderful opportunity for us to do something good in the world. But looking back, it's also true, I think, that we went pell-mell into environmental advocacy, in part because we anticipated that the new issues were there. Though one might not appreciate it today, the American environmentalism of the late 1960s and early 1970s was rather radical. Reality was radicalizing, and many of the nation's leading environmental thinkers and practitioners concluded that deep societal change was needed. GDP and the national income accounts were challenged for the failure to measure things that really matter. The most forceful challenge to GDP ever written was in Robert Kennedy's last major speech in 1968. A sense of planetary limits was palpable. Limits to Growth appeared in 1972 and sold over 1 million copies. Its authors and others saw a fundamental incompatibility between limitless growth and an increasingly small and limited planet. Scientists Paul and Ann Ehrlich and John Holdren, current President Science Advisor, in 1973 argued that an economy we needed an economy that would be non-growing
in terms of the size of the human population, the quantity of physical resources in use, and its impact on the biological environment. Joined with this was a call from many sources for us to break from our consumerist and materialistic ways to seek simpler lives in harmony with nature and each other. These advocates recognized, as Ehrlich and Holdren put it, that with growth no longer available as a palliative, one problem that must be faced squarely is the redistribution of wealth within and between nations. They also recognize the importance of creating employment opportunities by stimulating employment in areas long underserved by the economy and by moving to shorter work weeks. And they saw that none of this was likely without a dramatic revitalization of democratic life. It was these and similar ideas, including Barry Commoner's actual critique of capitalism in his best-selling book, that motivated me in my initial years at NRDC. Yes, I and others had opted to work within the system, but I believed that legal advocacy could change the system. I believed that what I was doing was on the path to deeper change. And throughout the 1960s and 70s, awareness of environmental degradation was growing. In fact, it was hard not to be aware in that era. Our environmental problems of the day were in your face and in your backyard, and I saw them rooted in a wider set of maladies. When the opportunity came to do something about it, it came not as a stranger, but something half expected, known, and welcomed. Such a radically different situation then in the context, than the one that we face today. You may have noticed that I mentioned two things that I think of now as lost legacies. One was the early tradition of radicalism in the environmental movement and environmental community. And the other lost legacy was the connection to the civil rights movement and to the African American community and their battle for civil rights. And we lost those along the way. We put them aside for reasons that I'll explain now. And what we found instead, and what drew us inside the Washington Beltway and into the heart of the American establishment, if you will, was the enactment, surprisingly, perhaps to you, that it had this effect. But we decided, I mentioned that we wanted to use tort law and property law and other traditional forms of law. But what happened was, by the time we got to Washington in 1969, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, had been written in 1969. The Clean Air Act was written in 1970. The Clean Water Act in 1972. This whole phalanx of environmental law, some of which is now being used, of all things, to address the climate issue because they can't get any action on doing anything else. So we're addressing the climate issue through a 1970 Clean Air Act law. Thank goodness we're doing something. This huge phalanx of legislation came in, and what we saw was this magnificent opportunity as activists, as lawyers at that time, young lawyers, but other types of activists and others, to try to ensure effective implementation of these laws. So we began to work the courts and the legislatures and the agencies, and it was kind of incestuous at some point, because it was certainly a heyday of progress in this area. And I remember having lunch with an EPA lawyer one time, and he said, Gus, you know, we just learned that the Corps of Engineers is restricting Section 404 to the head of navigation. Now that probably sounds like Greek to some people, but I realized that what he was saying was that the Corps of Engineers has just decided not to protect and regulate the huge, almost all freshwater wetlands in the United States, and sort of putting that off limits in the Clean Water Act. And I said to the lawyer, I said, that would be a pretty good lawsuit. And he sort of looked at me and said, well, why do you think we're having lunch? And so it was, but we couldn't really lose. I mean, we brought so many lawsuits at that point to implement these laws, to ensure that they were effectively interpreted and implemented. And it really was a great moment. And it's continued, and that type of advocacy has continued, and I started to think what the world would be like if we didn't have that sort of inside the beltway traditional work to try to make our system perform. But it came at a very high cost, looking back. In fact, thanks to wonderful people like Senator Ed Muskie, the politicians were ahead of us. They were writing these laws faster than we could push for them. And what that meant was, well, we really didn't need to go out and get a lot of politicians elected. They were already there. We didn't need to build up the political infrastructure and grassroots support. And we didn't need to build these huge constituencies across issues that we now see that we so desperately need. Support was very bipartisan. So we sort of became nonpartisan. Didn't want to get into electoral politics and didn't. And it's still a huge problem with the environmental community when we now so desperately need it. And environmental programs and law and policy became federalized. And the states and the cities had been the problems in not doing the jobs under some of the earlier laws. So we became very focused on Washington and neglected the states and the cities. And so, what happens when Washington goes bankrupt? We're not where we ought to be. And the media, I would get calls from major newspapers, and the guy would say something like, I'm writing a story on feedlots, can I call you back in 30 minutes for a great quote? And I'd think up something to say about it. Feedlots, my gosh. And it'd be in the front page or big page of the newspaper the next day, the story. The media, when you had that kind of great reporters wanting this beat and writing all the stuff and getting Walter Cronkite on television with his Can the World Be Saved series on the evening news, you didn't need to think a lot about media strategy and communication strategy, and we didn't. And we didn't have sort of independent think tanks that were providing independent judgment on whether we perhaps were winning battles but losing the war. And most importantly, we neglected and didn't see the real problem, which was what people like Ehrlich and Kaminer and Holdren and others were talking about, in the earlier period, that the major sources of economic and political power had other priorities. And they gradually asserted themselves during the 1970s, and we had not built up the kind of political force and the wherewithal to counter that. And these problems have continued to bedevil our organized environmental, our mainstream environmental community ever since. So I want to sort of go into with you at this point sort of my assessment then of where we stand, where that has left us. We can certainly say that over those decades, the environmental groups have grown in strength and funding and membership and sophistication, and can now count a long string of victories, every one of them. And as I said earlier, we shudder to think where we would be without these victories. The little groups that we started in 1970 now have budgets over $100 million a year. And, but in so doing, by the process that I mentioned a second ago, we left by the wayside the more difficult underlying challenges that Ehrlich and Kamina and others had noted 40 years earlier. And our early successes at these new patterns of what I could call the sort of inside the beltway work sort of locked us in to a pattern of action which involved trying to raise public consciousness, lobby the agencies, litigate, but not develop a mighty political force. I put it this way, that we opted to work within the system of political economy that we found, and we neglected to seek transformation of that system itself. And so we arrived at what I think is the central issue, the paradox that the environmental community has got to face today. The environmental movement has grown in strength and sophistication, but the environment has continued to go downhill. Surely a lot of things are better, but all in all, if we look at real-world conditions and trends, we see that we are winning victories but losing the planet. To the point that a ruined world looms as a real prospect for our children and grandchildren. I've looked hard at the environmental conditions and trends in our country and abroad in 4 books now for Yale Press and over the past decade, and it's a frightening picture. I'm not going to recite all of the problems with you, you know them. Things that we thought we had under control, like drinking water quality, turned out to be huge remaining problems. So here we are, 46 years after that burst of energy that was the first Earth Day, and we're headed straight towards the ruined planet. All we have to do to destroy the climate, impoverish the biota, and toxify our people is to keep doing exactly what we're doing today. With no growth in human populations, no growth in our national or world economies, just continue to release greenhouse gases at current rates, continue to impoverish ecosystems at current rates, continue to release toxics as we're doing now, and the world in the latter part of the century that we are in won't be fit for our descendants. But of course, human activities are not holding their own at current levels. We're growing at phenomenal rates in historical terms. And so we've run now, I would say, a half-century experiment on whether this mainstream environmentalism that I was so involved in can succeed. And I think the results are in. The full burden of managing the accumulating environmental threats has fallen on the environmental community and its supporters, people in government and out of government, but the burden is too great. Here's how I would put it. Environmental problems that we see today and have seen mature in past decades, those problems are rooted in the defining features of the political economy that we've got now. And questioning society-wide commitment to economic growth at any cost, a measure of growth, GDP, that includes everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, powerful corporate interests whose overriding objective is to grow by generating profit, including profit from avoiding the large environmental costs they create, markets that systematically fail to recognize environmental costs unless directed by government, and government that is subservient to corporate interest and the growth imperative, runaway consumerism spurred endlessly on by sophisticated advertising, social injustice and economic insecurity that paralyzes needed action, an insecurity so vast that it often empowers the false claims that needed measures would slow growth or hurt the economy or create job problems, cost jobs. And overall economic activity so large that its impact alter the fundamental biophysical, geophysical operation of the planet. So all of these factors combine to create this system of political economy, an ever-growing system that's undermining the ability of the planet to sustain human and natural communities. So I think we can say now safely that after a half century of trying, that we need something different. More of the same is clearly not going to work. We've had a lot more of the same. We need a new environmentalism, and I think this is the core of the new environmentalism. It seeks a different economy, a new economy, and it needs a new politics to deliver it. So here's the nub of it, I think. We've got to ask ourselves again, what is an environmental issue? And traditionally, you would answer that question with air pollution or climate change or biodiversity loss or toxic impacts. But what if the real answer to the question of what's an environmental issue is an environmental issue is something that seriously affects environmental outcomes, seriously affects environmental results. And if you answer the question that way, you get a lot of different answers to what should be an environmental issue. For example, certainly the creeping plutocracy and corporatocracy that we face, the ascendancy of money power over people power, that's an environmental issue. The chartering and unleashing of artificial persons to do virtually anything in the name of profit and growth. The very nature of today's corporation, that's an environmental issue, the nature of the corporation. Our fetish of GDP and its growth, and as one of the main aims of government. Our runaway consumerism and throwaway communities. The vast social insecurity with half of America's families living paycheck to paycheck, and as was recently again confirmed, 40% of the families not able to raise even modest amounts of money should they have an emergency. These are huge factors affecting environmental outcomes, and so we need to think of them as environmental concerns, imperative ones. But hardly any issue on that list is high on the agenda of today's mainstream environmental organizations. So when we see the problem this way, we've got to set it in the larger context to see the environmental issue as part of a systemic problem. We now have, as you appreciate, problems emerging across the whole front of national life. Environmentally, which we've been talking about, socially, politically, economically. And when you have problems across the whole front of a society, and I looked recently at the available data, and I looked at 20 rich and advanced industrial democracies, so-called, and I looked at 30 indicators of national well-being across all of these issues, from education to health to environment, democratic performance. And the United States is at the bottom, literally at the bottom of essentially all of these indicators. So what we need, I believe, is to find the path to deep change in the nature of the corporation, in our own consumerist behavior, in our growth fetish, and across a dozen fronts that I've identified in a couple of books, that in effect move us towards a different system of political economy, one that doesn't give priority overwhelmingly to profit and production and to power, but gives that priority to people and to place and to planet and we know an awful lot about how to move in these directions, both nationally. And the great thing about what's happening in our country today is that there are a tremendous number of local experiments, transition towns, and countless new forms of corporate organization, new forms taking shape. So it's not like we don't know how to get there. We know an awful lot, and we've created a number of organizations that are looking at this now. One is called the New Economy Coalition. We now have 140 organizational members of the New Economy Coalition, and we have started something called the Next System Project, where we are publishing alternative visions of different political economies, of different systems, online, and trying to stimulate a discussion of these things. So the situation is bleak but far from hopeless. Thank you very much. I tried to keep roughly to my allotted time, and I'd be happy to have comments from anybody about anything. We'll try to answer some questions if you have them, or comment on something. Yes, please.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Coalition for a New Economy?
Yeah.
Who's in it and what are they working on?
Well, I think it's fledgling, and we have there are a number of local organizations. There are national organizations like this wonderful group called People's Action, which is a coalition of grassroots organizations and community action organizations. And the biggest thing that is going on now is that they're beginning to form these groups into an active network of partnerships, and have now, and then coming up this summer, there's the third sort of gathering of this group. This one will be in Buffalo. We expect perhaps 1,000 people to come to the conference in Buffalo called Common Bound, and it will bring all these groups together, and there are a huge number of discussion groups about different things. And I think, the communities in this area are taking on a lot of these issues of combining local and environmental and social justice issues, and trying to become more political. And we thought when we started some of these things, we thought we were going to be out on a limb, so to speak, politically, but then, along comes our friend Senator Sanders and the Pope, and started talking about these things in a serious way. So I think it's, and young people have a very open mind to deep change. I don't think the concepts of capitalism and socialism are very, very precise, to say the least. But when you ask young people that question, which system would you prefer? It's really rather amazing that it's about 50-50. So I think, things are changing. And it's not well reflected in our national politics, except with Senator Sanders, I think. Yeah. Yes.
On an earlier occasion, I recall you were saying something about the need for alternative currencies, in other words, an alternative to the dollar transaction flow. And I wondered if you could direct me to some information on that, and if you feel you have time to make some remarks on that.
Well, I may have mentioned it. I certainly don't think I'm an authority on it. But there is somebody here in the state who is, and who's written some books about it. Gwendolyn Hall-Smith. Does anybody know Gwen? And she has a couple of books on this, and as well as, she's been very active in promoting state banks, which Vermont is supposed to have it. And I think the other area that I would look to for information is the work of the Schumacher Center in the Berkshires. I can't remember which Berkshire town that their headquarters are located in, but they have a currency, the Berkshires, and they have I know that they, the idea, at least there are different views about this, but at least one is that you need an ecology of currencies, not just what I think is happening in a number of places is that there is a local currency that encourages local buying and encourages people to buy local, and it stimulates incubation of local business entities of different types, of co-ops and other things. And but there are people who want to go, way beyond that and think about a multiplicity of different currencies for different purposes. And there's that. At the sort of grandest scale, you have this proposal which is getting a certain amount of support, which I'll mention, to go back to the days when basically you had the government creating money and spending it directly in the economy. The so-called Chicago Plan, and now the new Chicago Plan, which was proposed by a bunch of conservative economists in the University of Chicago. The idea is that today, almost all money is bank created. You take out a mortgage, you create a huge amount of money. You take out a loan, you create a huge amount of money. And most money is created by banks. And they charge you for it. So most money is debt money. And, there was a time when we had systems where government would just spend directly into the economy. Canada had such a system in effect through the Bank of Canada until about 1974, I think. Basically you just really, you limit creation of you do something quite subversive to the banking industry, which is to limit their lending to money actually on deposit. So they can't create debt money without anything backing it up. And so anyhow, but this has picked up a certain amount of support. Martin Wolf, the chief economic columnist for the Financial Times, has editorialized about this. And the new head of the Labour Party in the UK, Cronin, is proposed something like this. So that's very different from the local currency issue, but this whole issue of how we got, in effect, captured by a banking system. And we should go back to Lincoln's creation of greenbacks and have government be able to spend directly into the economy without having to borrow the money. And the sort of traditional argument is, that creates inflation. Well, it need not. I mean, it just needs to be done intelligently. And like so many of the answers to all of these issues, if we don't have intelligent, functioning, disciplined government, we're not going to be able to do any of these things. So in many ways, getting our politics on track and creating strong democratic, truly democratic institutions from the ground up is necessary. We don't have to look hard at a long list of political reforms which could, really reassert or assert real democracy in our country, starting, of course, with campaign finance reform, but there are many long lists of easily available things, guaranteeing the right to vote, and nonpartisan districting, and free media time, and a host of other things that we could do to revitalize our politics, including a lot of reforms in Washington and the methodologies and revolving doors and things that we tolerate today that are so corrupting. So in many ways, it's hard to build a national democracy unless we are really centered in democratic institutions at the state and local level. So anyhow, I think the whole political reform issue is something we ought to all be able to come together and to work together on. I know there's a lot of Tea Party people and others who have views very different from mine are concerned about the political system. Yeah.
I think what you say about nature corporations is a big part of the problem. My limited understanding, someone had told me once that it used to be the case that corporations had to serve the public interest and that the United States government would in fact disincorporate companies. But
Yeah, in the very early days, you were supposed to have a public purpose.
So is there any, have you, as a lawyer, couldn't you ever go back to public common law or something like that and attack it?
Well, there's a lot that could be done. Again, it sounds like kind of pie in the sky. Now, there were some people who, I think it was in Virginia, filed a papers of incorporation for the creation of a new company that would, which they said would use tobacco to kill hundreds of thousands of people annually. And it was really the stated purpose. And it went to the state office that certifies, approves corporate incorporation, usually the Secretary of State, and they disapproved it, So there's really, you could have chartering laws. We could have a national, corporation charter in the U.S. rather than at the state level. And have some real provisions in there. They could be public review of adherence to standards that are set forth for corporations. You could have sunset. You could put corporations on a short leash to straighten out if they were misbehaving. So you could use the chartering process and periodic revisions of public charters to get a handle. But what the most interesting thing, I think, is the way that, there are a lot now of new incorporation laws being created at the state level, including in Vermont. So you could have for-benefit corporations where you're not obligated, in fact, to get the provisions, you have to behave in the public interest with a public purpose. But that's a separate corporation. But there are all kinds of ways of having social enterprises. Public-private hybrids, profit, not-for-profit hybrids. The whole co-op business is flourishing. And we were just in Spain, where, of course, they have this huge multi-billion dollar co-op system, the Mondragon system in the Basque region, and they're selling products all over the world. So a co-op is not an inherently tiny thing. You could go to scale. You could have, we have provisions now for regulating certain corporations, including the direction of their investment and what they can invest in and what they can't.
But you think
It's
this
called
would require-
Public Utilities Regulation. And we could bring a whole,
New law. I mean,
New
there's
law.
not, there's nothing implicit in current corporation law or common law that you could vote against them now without requiring legislation.
it would be a long, hard trip, to get there that way. It's been so, people struggle with this idea that the corporation always had to act in the best interest of the shareholder. I mean, that became kind of a legal rubric, and so that sort of became in some interpretations maximizing shareholder value. The mission of the corporation is to maximize shareholder value, and so it's been a struggle just to get that more generalized, so that it was not. They were struck with suits brought by some, people interested in high returns against corporations that were doing things, social responsibility things. And so that became that's where the battle has been, so to speak, in thinking about what the law currently says about corporations. Can you really try hard to be a socially responsible corporation to the point that you're costing your shareholders some money? And and I think there's been some progress on that in terms of yes, you can. It's not but anyhow, it's much easier to try to set up new corporations with a social purpose. So there are a lot of, my friend Marjorie Kelly, if you're interested, has written a book about, how to set up a corporation that will protect the social purpose over time. Because what happens in a lot of cases is that people start out with a high-mindedness, and as they grow and their ownership changes and the board changes and other things, they become more and more traditional in their orientation.
So if the traditional advocacy organizations have essentially failed us, at least in part, over the past 50 years.
Can I comment? Save your question.
Yeah.
I want to comment on something. I listed a lot of failures on the part of the traditional organizations, okay? And I think we made some mistakes, and we were kind of captured by that, by a system that encouraged us to perform in certain ways to succeed. What I didn't go into was the fact that as a problem pales by comparison to the opposition and the behaviors of what we were up against. I mean, so I don't want to blame the victim entirely. We were also have all been victimized by huge corporate malfeasance and maldistribution of power and influence. But please.
But at least if that's not what we need in the future to get us all the way, then what is? And how can I, as a young person, be part of that and contribute to that? Because if you look at some of the successful current organizations, WRI, the Nature Conservancy, the leadership of those organizations, usually a lot of Wall Street guys, and that's sort of the trajectory you see in those. So if those organizations won't get us there, what will? And how can I be part of that? What is needed? What capacity building is needed today to bring us forward?
Well, I think the door that's open is to try to bring different progressive communities together locally. I think that's kind of where it starts. I wish that the leaders of in one of my books I listed sort of a whole 30 or 40 different progressive constituencies. And people are so siloed at the national level. So you've got groups working on tax reform that don't talk to groups that are working on other policy areas, for example, or environmental policy, which is one of the most siloed. But at the local level, you know, it should be possible to forge coalitions between people that are concerned about local environmental issues, people that are concerned about local housing issues, people that are concerned about Black lives, and to, you know, bring, so I would say, you know, go local and try to, there's a wonderful group that I'm marginally associated with called the Democracy Collaborative. And there's another group called the Institute for Social Self-Reliance. And both of them are full of examples of communities that are coming together to blend the social and environmental and economic uplift issues. And I think to be part of that is to get on the ground floor of where the real change is beginning. If you go to this website, www.wealth-building, wealth building, it's really about community wealth building. And there's some wonderful examples there of dozens of communities which are bringing these things together. You know, political issues, democratization, social justice, racial justice, environmental performance together at the local level. And you know, I think that is the place. Now, the thing I have a place to begin is to you know, build on these models, because when the system becomes progressively delegitimized, and I think it will, people are going to begin to look more seriously around across the landscape and see what's really working and who's got the right answers for. And often these are devastated communities which are, you know, don't have a lot else, a lot of other options than to try to lift themselves up. Often they're community, you know, college communities. But it's, I would say that's the place to go. And there's another wonderful place that's collecting positive examples in addition to the Democracy Collaborative and others. It came out of Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, and they created a website. I think it begins with This Changes Everything, but it's called Beautiful Solutions. And there are hundreds of examples there now, more global and not strictly U.S. Of community change. So if I were, I guess if I were starting over, and I would, and wanted to do something environmental, I would try to create or work towards something called, you know, for lack of a more creative phrase, something like, you know, environmentalists for political reform, and try to bring the environmental community writ large into a coalition with others that would seek the national and local and other reform of our political system before it's too late. Yeah.
Recently, there was somebody from Black Lives Matter who had been invited to the White House and who declined to come. And the president said that those young people in those people in Black Lives Matter kind of should work within the system. And hearing your story of how working within the system, things seem to go really well, but you didn't get the political consciousness. Do you feel that they haven't, you know, this is similar?
You know, honestly, I don't know what the president may have said, but that would not be my recommendation. I think we need to be in the streets and disruptive and causing people to, you know, social movements take all types, and certainly, you know, I think we need to bear witness to grievances that people have, and they shouldn't hold back. I don't think of myself as a great protester, but I did spend 3 days in jail in D.C. On the pipeline issue, and I may have been the only person to ever give a 45-minute lecture in the central cell block of the D.C. jail. And I was asked to give it by my cellmate Bill McKibben, and I thought, well, I'll just have to do it. You can see I can easily talk for 45 minutes. I guess my time is up. Somebody politely might.